Welcome. I'm Hernan Murdoch. In this episode, we're going to take a closer look at verbal communications and planning to make sure that those are going to be effective. To better understand how we can make verbal communications more effective and the process that goes into the run up to them, we have with us today Kathleen Crawford, who is very knowledgeable in this subject area, and we are happy to have you here, Kathleen.
Thanks, Hernan. Good to be here.
So we spend a lot of time on verbal communications. Some of it is presenting, but a lot of it is also interviewing individuals, talking with them, understanding their processes, their programs, their activities, and all of those different things. But sometimes we just jump into what happens in the middle of that process. How about we back up a little bit and think about what happens before we actually engage with the party? So, what are some of the things we need to keep in mind as we do this?
Well, I'd like to start off with setting a tone. And the tone comes from a quote that I read a long while ago from an interviewing textbook, handbook. So, John Joseph Brady said that the interview is more than a simple process of asking questions, it's a relationship, however brief, between two people. And so I'd like to start with that tone. I'd like to start with that concept because as internal auditors, there are folks that we are going to interact with once or twice throughout our career or our life within a particular organization. But invariably, there are quite a few people that we will see again and again and again. And I think it's important to recognize that this is a human being that you're connecting with, or these are groups of people that you're connecting with. They're colleagues, even if they don't work with you in internal auditing, you work for the same organization. So I think it's really vital to try to create a connection, a collegial connection.
That is so important because a big part of what we hear in the profession these days is how important it is to build a relationship with our
Mm-hmm.
clients. So this definitely connects with that, and it's important to be reminded we work for the same organization. And
Right.
from that perspective, we want to make sure that we build a good relationship along the way. So that's a very important way to start this conversation.
Mm-hmm.
So, what are some of the key things we should be looking at and doing as we're planning for this exchange, this communication with that party?
Well, there's a lot to unpack. So I frame it in the context of purpose, of preparation, and of planning. So, what is our purpose? Do we have an objective? And what are those objectives? And I'm not just talking about audit objectives, though that's part of it, but what are your objectives specifically for this conversation or for this meeting? What do you hope to accomplish? Is this a meet and greet? Or is this more than a meet and greet? Is this an opportunity to learn more about the area process or system that you've been reading about or that you have otherwise been exposed to get better understanding of how things work? So, what are your objectives? That's straight out of the box. Then I'd like people to think about where is this conversation going to take place? So, is it going to be in a conference room over here, or is it going to be on the shop floor? Is it going to be in an office, a very open office environment? You really want to think carefully about the environment because there are issues of noise and there are issues of privacy in an open office environment. So, especially with people that you've not met before, it's not like you're going to walk up to them and shake the hand and sit in the spare chair in their cubicle. We have to think these things through,
Right.
right?
Exactly.
What are we going to be covering? Are the topics that this person or this group that we're talking to are informed on? We want to make sure that they're relevant to their sphere of endeavor, to their sphere of influence. So research the topics and try to acquaint yourself with what you're going to be discussing. That's where a lot of the research comes in terms of reading policies, procedures, and maybe prior audit work papers, things of that nature. But think of it more specifically as the rules of engagement. Who is this person I'm going to be partnering with for a short period of time where I'm asking them to share with me? How can I make sure that I'm at least moderately informed about what they do and how they do it so that they don't
Right.
have to spend all their time schooling me on what they do.
Right.
Then
Exactly.
the person himself or herself. I am a big fan of getting job descriptions and organizational charts to try to figure out where people fit in the wider scheme of how this area processor system works.
Hmm.
So it's it could be quite an undertaking to do this kind of background information, but most of it's going to be in the context of our planning the audit anyway. Now, when we
Right.
get to the brass tacks of the meeting, what do you want your general agenda to be?
Hmm.
I have the term script here in this graphic, and I'll keep it there because we're talking about interviews. But I'd like people to
Hmm.
think more about keeping this conversational and less invested in a particular script on your screen. There are
Hmm.
topics that you definitely want to explore. Keep your main topics on your list so that you can share your agenda with the person or group that you're talking to.
Hmm.
But also try to anticipate the direction of the conversation in your own thinking, in your own planning, so that if it goes, left or right, you'll be able to naturally follow up with a couple of probing questions or summaries of what they've said so far, or other sorts of things like that.
It's interesting because people talk about having an agenda for meetings very often. It's been a practice or a recommendation that's been around for a long time, but very seldom you hear anyone talking about having an objective
Mm-hmm.
before you set up your agenda. And I think that's such an important miss in many cases, because then what happens is you can have an agenda that doesn't really get anything accomplished per se.
Right.
When we're auditing, a big part of that is knowing why you're having this meeting. What is it you're trying to find out? What are you trying to confirm, verify, understand about something? And you walk in so that when you're done, hopefully you'll be able to say, yes, now I understand it. Now I know it. I verified it. So you kind of bookend the meeting that way, and then your agenda is now going to be more purposeful. And also, as you were relating back to questions or a script or something along those lines, then you're going to make sure that what you're asking is going to be aligned with your objectives so that you support each other that way. So those are very important things to keep in mind. And of course, knowing the person helps you to build rapport. So that's another thing we want to do, because sometimes people, when they hear that they're going to meet with the auditor, they get a little tense. That's
Mm-hmm.
just to understand, to know, and to acknowledge. So from that perspective, it's something to also be mindful about. So getting to know the person can also allow you that ability to chat a little bit about something that kind of warms them up a little bit, let them know that yes, you're a colleague of theirs, you just happen to do different kind of work, but you work
Mm-hmm.
for the same organization. So and of course we're here to try to help them understand the process so we can identify areas for improvement. So if we are able to put that in context, I think it'll make those meetings far more productive. So what else about this preparation that we should keep in mind?
I'd also argue that we want to evaluate the constraints of the person, of the time and the
Hmm.
place. So, what does this person do? What is his or her role or responsibility? Are there times of the day that are going to be less convenient for them? Maybe they settle up an account or something around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I'm just hypothesizing here, but the more that we do look at job descriptions and organizational charts, and we sort of get a lay of the land of their roles and their responsibilities, that's probably going to clue us in terms of a time that might be more or less convenient. Certainly, other constraints. If we say would like to meet with them for an hour, is that reasonable for them or not reasonable for them? How busy
Mhm.
is their office? How busy are their responsibilities? Are there going to be a lot of interruptions, for example? So, what
Yeah.
kinds of constraints could we make ourselves aware of beforehand? And that's really what this is all about. What can I make myself aware of and prepare for that possibility or that eventuality in my
Mhm.
plan, so that I can I can increase the likelihood for his or her benefit, for my benefit, that this will be a productive discussion.
Right. And we want to find out what is really going on. So, from that perspective, any kind of dynamic that will limit their comfort with the meeting, they may have, not just that they have another meeting maybe right after yours, but
Hmm.
if they have to prepare for that meeting. I've had instances where I wanted to talk with someone at a certain time, and I'm glad I asked if that was a convenient time or if there was going to be any impediment to being able to cover this subject at length, because in some cases they needed to pick up their children, they needed to go to another meeting, they had to prepare for another meeting. Different, and you used the example of like a reconciliation, a very
Hmm.
important procedure they have to perform that is time sensitive.
Right.
So those kinds of things can limit their comfort, their ability to detail procedures and practices and nuances and issues that they want to share with you. They just don't have that comfort because they have other things on their minds. So if
Indeed.
you can preempt those things, it'll make the meeting far more productive.
Indeed.
So if we were to think about the process of preparing and conducting these things, and if we think about any kind of phases that are relevant to this process, is there such a thing?
Yes, indeed there is. And I actually want to use the phases. I'll talk about them in general. And I'd like to go back to something that you were just saying in terms of somebody might have, they might be pressed for time. So the structure of an interview follows this general procedure. We have a period of opening. I'll talk about. Why don't I talk about them in the broader context, and then we'll break it down individually. So from start to finish, 1 through 5. Think of 1 and 2 as the beginning, which is going to be relatively short. And think of 4 and 5 as the end, which is also going to be relatively short. And then the questions and answers are marked with asterisk on the graphic because this is where the lion's share of your time and energy and even your preparation should be spent. So questions and answers in well done interviews will typically take 75 to 80% of the time that you have allotted. Let's say you had an hour, about 45 minutes of your hour should be spent on Q&A.
Okay.
Then as you ease into your questions and answers, your opening and your feed forward. Your opening is what we think of as meetings, introductions, might even be arranging seating or making a choice to move the meeting if, say, it is an inconvenient time. We're going to find that out right out of the box so that we don't waste our time nor theirs. If it's not a good time, then we're going to, reschedule.
Mhm.
What about feed forward? Feed forward is a transitional phase where basically the auditor indicates that it's going to be a series of questions and conversation, and it's a dialogue. Let's have a dialogue about these few topics that I shared with you before. Oh, you don't have the agenda I sent? I happen to have an extra copy for you. So these are the opportunities that we take and feed forward to smooth out and remind people why we're there, what our objectives are, the agenda that we sent ahead of time, which will be very high level, just a series of topics, and you're
Mhm.
going to ask questions and answers around those topics.
Okay.
As we the questions should be mostly open-ended questions, so it is
Mhm.
a dialogue. And then as we're ready to wrap up, you might want to sweep with a question just to make sure that you've got everything that they want to share with you. And I'll usually ask some variation of, if there was one thing you thought we should discuss today and I haven't brought it up, what would it be? So one thing,
Mhm.
one concern, one issue, one topic, one burning question, something like that. And then just offer it out. And if they pick it up, great. If nothing comes to mind, then you move into feedback, which is another transitional phase. And there you're going to be getting ready to leave, but not quite leaving, maybe checking over your notes as far as commitments that have been made on both sides. If you're supposed to provide some information or they're supposed to provide information, let's make sure we get those down and the timing of that. If your department's practice happens to be to share notes from interviews,
Mhm.
not everybody does that, but if that's your practice, then you might talk about when they can expect that And then you're ready to close your laptop, stand up, shake hands, and off you go. And that's closing.
Okay. Very good. Yeah, so I like that process because it kind of walks you through systematically through that engagement with individual, and that window of 1 hour, which is very common, the duration. Generally speaking, I try to keep my meetings under 2 hours. There's just too much going on, too much of a time block committed for one activity. So I usually try to do it in 1 hour increments and so on. And then another thing that I also like to do at the end, relate to that closing that you mentioned, is just to recap some of the key takeaways. So make sure I understood some of the key things that we're talking about. And also, if there are any other thing that I need to do, or like you mentioned, sending the notes back for their review and so on. But also if there's another meeting that I need to have with someone else, just to make sure that I get that right as well, so that then I can move on from that meeting and get ready for the next engagements and meetings that I need to have with other individuals. So these are some of the ways to make it so that you know what you're going in with your objectives, you accomplish your objectives, and if there's still some loose ends, you're able to then have some action items going forward. Yeah.
I just thought of one other thing. If we could go back to that graphic again. I was also thinking, as you were talking earlier about, people being pressed for time, that I'd like to offer up another helpful hint. This isn't going to work in all instances, but I encourage auditors to really, really be tactical about what they're going to ask in an interview. If there are things that you can learn in other ways, let's be really mindful of taking people's time. We are auditors, but we are also an interruption. Our work is an interruption to their work. So if we can be alert to that and try to plan out something that we think we can accomplish in even less than that hour that we have available. So let's say 3/4 of that time, then that means your question and the answers need to be really stripped down and really, really specifically relevant to this conversation. So I would argue for let's see if we can't have an objective to give people a gift of time.
They will appreciate it.
Yes.
Right? In many cases, like you said, it's a disruption to their normal course of work. So from that perspective, if we were to give them back some of the time, they will definitely appreciate it. And we go right back to what we're saying in terms of maintaining those relationships. So that's the important thing to keep in mind, to be respectful of their time and respectful of them as individuals as well. So this has been good because now we have a better understanding about the process of preparing for that encounter and making it more productive as we look at those different phases. And along the way, I think a very important takeaway here is, number one, respect, and number two is relationship building and maintenance. So thank you very much, Kathleen. I really appreciate your help in understanding these topics.
Thank you, Hernan.
If you like this series, subscribe to the ACI Learning YouTube channel to enjoy more audit-related content.